Hi everyone, Thunder's Models here, and today I thought we'd do something a little different and tackle a starter set challenge. In this case, it's the Airfix Red Arrows Gnat in 1/72nd scale. Now, what is a starter set challenge, you might ask? Well, it's something that I borrowed from Matt over at Model Minutes. Essentially, you can only build a model using the items included in the starter set. No extra products, whether that's paint, decal solutions, a better brush, none of that. We're also challenging ourselves by attempting to use as many parts as possible. And even though we're using water to clean our brush, water may not be used to thin the paint. Similarly, water is the only thing allowed for applying the decals. The starter set that I've chosen is actually one from the 90s. You can see here that it comes with the kit, 2 paints, a tube of Humbrol cement, and a brush. The kit itself seemed to be in good enough condition, especially considering it was a tooling from the 60s. The decals were in quite good shape, and all things considered, there was relatively little flash on the plastic. The most disappointing piece was the pilot. Bad detail, tons of flash, and a pit mark. So bad in fact, I had to break rule number 2 and leave them out. I was not about to include that in there. The paints unfortunately had dried out who knows how long ago. However, I happen to have 2 of the same paints from a more recent Airfix starter set on hand, so I simply subbed those out for them. The brush was going to be fun too. It was low quality synthetic bristles with almost no shaping to it. The glue, however, was alright, albeit super thick. I did allow myself 2 pieces of additional equipment. A hobby knife for trimming pieces out of the sprue, and a toothpick for aiding in decal application. I figured that most people have these on hand, so it wasn't fully cheating the spirit of the challenge. The build itself was straightforward. Instructions were clear and concise, and overall there were few parts anyway, so there were not many steps involved. Per my normal building process, I removed the pieces from the sprue and placed them on the instructions where they would go, so as to help me to keep track of them. Once everything was free, I then went over them with the hobby knife to clean up any excess plastic at the gates, seam lines, or remaining flash. Then it was time to assemble. Because the cement was so thick, I tore a piece of card from the box and applied some cement there, similar to how one would use a palette for paint. I also took a second piece of card from the box and folded it into a point to serve as an applicator. With this setup, I was able to better control where and how much cement was applied. From there, it was a simple matter of following the instructions. The kit built up in the usual way plane models tend to. First the cockpit, then fuselage halves, then wings and stabilizers, and finally fine detail parts. One thing I did run across was an unseemly seam line down the center of the fuselage. Not entirely unexpected for a kit this age, but it needed correcting nonetheless. For the most part, all I needed to do was run the flat edge of the knife along the seam to knock it down. The painting would do the rest for me. Before I could close up the cockpit, I gave the entire interior a coat of the gray paint. I did wind up needing to use some of the water to help give the brush some semblance of a point, but that was a bit of a losing battle, as you'll see. To close up the canopy, I sharpened a spare piece of sprue to get an even finer point. I didn't want to risk the canopy fogging from the cement, and even the card applicator was too unprecise for this job. And then it was time for the paint. This was the part that I was the most trepidatious about, seeing as how the paint job was what makes or breaks these challenges, I think. For the first coat, I tried to keep a light hand and keep my strokes moving from nose to tail. My hope was that by being light-handed, I could both apply a thinner amount of paint and reduce brush strokes on this first pass. As I'm sure you've noticed by now, the paint kept doing this weird thing where the surface tension would pull the paint off of previously painted spots. I don't know if this was caused by a lack of primer, because I didn't wash the sprues, both of these, or some unknown fourth cause. All I needed to do though was go back over the spots, and eventually the paint would hold. Because I only had 2 colors, I did have to make a decision regarding the landing gear. I went with painting them red just for simplicity's sake, but hitting them in gray probably would have been better in hindsight. Once this first coat was dry, I went over it all a second time to eliminate any blotchiness in the paint finish. This second coat was applied perpendicular to the first so as to eliminate the buildup of any brush strokes. I think it worked out quite well, don't you? Then it was time to apply the decals. Since I couldn't use my tweezers, I held each decal in the warm water until it began to slide from the backing paper. I then slid it onto the model according to the instructions. Oh, that's right, there was one additional piece of equipment I used. I took a cotton bud and used it to remove any excess water from on top of and underneath the decal. Again, I think this was still in the spirit of the challenge due to being something everyone has at home as well as being mentioned in the instructions themselves, but technically it does violate rule number 1, so you can hold that against me if you wish. The worst thing about these decals was the fact that these were the kind where you have to apply the red center dot separate from the rest of the roundel. I understand why it was done that way due to printing limitations and whatnot, but I guess I'm just spoiled with today's quality of kits. The decal for the fin flash also had some excess carrier film that hung off the edge of the tail, but this was easily cleaned up with a hobby blade. And once all of the decals were in place, the kit was finished. While not my best model by any means, I'm quite happy with this one, all things considered. For a challenge build, it's not nearly as bad as I was fearing it would be. Overall, I was excited to start this one, and I'm happy to say that it delivered, at least for me. I've seen a number of other channels attempt these, and it looked like a great deal of fun, including Model Minutes, who I think started it all, Moss 6510 Models, and Kits and Bits Scale Modeling. So what do you think? Did I do well? Would you consider giving the starter set challenge a try yourself? Let me know in the comments below. If you want to see more of my videos, don't forget to like and subscribe and all of that. Linked here is another one of my videos if you want to keep watching, and in the meantime, stay safe and keep modeling.